Welcome back to The Last Sip. We're talking about climate change's effect on our communities. As fossil fuels and the resulting carbon pollution are the identified cause of climate change, what are some of the big answers to how we can tackle the climate crisis? One response, championed by 350.org and other environmental organizations, is to call for government pension and private investment funds to divest from fossil fuel companies. Here to talk about why is Thanu Yakupitiyage, head of U.S. communications at 350.org. Now, in full disclosure, Thanu and I worked on a project to highlight the ongoing effects of Hurricane Sandy on communities of color, so we just have to be transparent about that. Thanks for joining us, first of all. Thanu, fossil fuel companies make up 4 out of the 5 largest companies in the world. And if you add fossil reliant companies, specifically car companies, it's 6 out of the 10 largest companies in the world. Given this power, what can divestment do? What hope can we have to tackle the climate crisis through divestment, given just their disproportionate impact and power in the world through the economy and economic means?
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, thank you for having me. Divestment, I think, is a really critical response to a lot of social and economic problems. And in regards to climate change, divestment is the way in which we can take money out of corporations that are fueling the climate crisis, who have actively lied about the climate crisis for decades. So, for example, there have been reports from that both Exxon and Shell knew about climate change, and they've been hiding this for over 30 years. And regardless of the fact that they knew what some of the impacts would be, they still decided that, digging for fossil fuels was the way to go. Only 2 weeks ago, Shell, there was a report about Shell out saying that as recent as 1998, they predicted that by 2010, 2012, there would be a major climate catastrophe such as Hurricane Sandy, and they actually predicted what would happen in New York. And so what we're really trying to do with divestment is really shift resources away from corporations and companies and to communities and to community solutions.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, why do you think that divestment is the answer for communities of color in the U.S. and around the world? Because there's so many different ways that they have to respond. And as we quote, manage retreat, which means to flee and find new places. There are a full range of responses that are possible. So why do you think that it's an answer specifically for the communities that you discussed? Yeah,
well, across the world, when there are climate impacts, the people most impacted in the US are communities of color. Around the world are vulnerable people and poor communities. And so when corporations like this are basically fueling the climate crisis, and yet the people who have the least to do with the problem, who have impacted it the least, are the ones who are suffering, it actually goes to show that by diverting resources to those communities, we're actually helping to protect and resource up communities that actually had nothing to do with the problem. So New York City, for example, in January, New York City divested its pension funds, a total of $5 billion, which is significant. New York City, it becomes basically the first major city in the US to divest from fossil fuels, and they're suing 5 of the major fossil fuel companies for climate change damages, specifically because of the damages caused by Hurricane Sandy. It was actually $65 billion in damages, and the majority of those damages were to places like the Rockaways, to Queens, that were places where working class, communities of color, and Black communities live.
So it is actually making fossil fuel companies pay in a way in this to strengthen these communities. What are those campaigns that actually work in terms of getting localities and companies to hold? I think it's something like 450 organizations have agreed to divest, right? So what does it look like when that happens?
It's actually 800 institutions across the world now that have divested.
Oh, wow.
And divestment is close to $6 trillion now.
Wow, okay.
So, and it's a slow build. That's the thing about divestment, is that it's a very slow build. Here in the US, it started on universities. It was very much like college students who were pushing for divestment.
Yeah, like South Africa.
Exactly, pushing for their universities to divest, faith institutions pushing for their institutions to divest, museums. And so when you see the slow build, what we saw in January with New York City was momentous for divestment campaigns because it really shows that a slow build works. And it seems initially like, oh, well, how are they going to do this? But if you really add up the numbers, it's over 6 trillion in divestment. And it's actually shifting the ways in which fossil fuel companies are thinking about their practices. They're actually being held accountable. And the truth is, they're afraid. Exxon and Shell are now basically being investigated by attorney generals across the country and the world. There are reports coming out showing that Exxon and Shell and other corporations actually knew about the impact of climate change 30 years ago, and yet knowing that knowledge, withholding the realities of climate change, still chose to burn fossil fuels and to sell fossil fuels. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of cities are now saying that, well, you know, climate change is impacting us, they're impacting the poorest of our communities, and we need to hold those accountable because these companies said that burning fossil fuels wasn't going to impact anything. And so these companies, as well as governments, they've lied to communities, and now communities are bearing the brunt. So the hope of divestment, I think, lies in really a major cultural, political, and social shift.
Well, thank you so much for coming and explaining what divestment is, how it actually can be an effective tool when used right, because they seem like such a behemoth, but there are answers and there's hope. So for more, please go to our website, thelaststep.org, and click on How to Help. You can find out more about divestment there and more about all of the ways in which you can get involved on the issue of climate change. Thanu, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll be right back.